In this section, we'll look some more at experiments and compare these with observational studies, which are sometimes done when experiments aren't possible. First, we'll go a little bit more in depth about experiments. The first randomized comparative experiment was published in 1948. Remember from the last section that a randomized comparative experiment is when a group of subjects are split randomly into a control group and a treatment group, and then after the experiment the effects on those two groups are compared. So now randomized comparative experiments are a standard research tool. For example, federal regulations require that the safety and effectiveness of new drugs be demonstrated by randomized comparative experiments. So even though this is a relatively new technique, it's become very prevalent. So we need to understand some of the words that are sometimes used to describe experiments. A medical study is often described as a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial. And there are a lot of words in here. Well, the first word is randomized, and we know what randomized means. This means that the group of subjects is randomly split into a control group and a treatment group. The next words we want to look at are double-blind. And a double-blind experiment is an experiment in which neither the experimental subjects nor the person who interacts with them know which treatment each subject received. So the subjects don't know whether they are in the control group or the treatment group, and neither do the people who are interacting with them. So the next words in here are placebo-controlled. A placebo is a treatment that appears the same as a real treatment, but should have no actual effect. So for example, if a new drug is being tested, then a placebo would be a sugar pill instead of the actual drug that's being tested. So in this case, instead of no treatment, the control group receives a placebo treatment, which looks the same as the actual treatment that's being tested, but should have no real effect. Finally, the last word we want to look at is clinical. And clinical means that actual medical patients were the subjects of the experiment. One thing that we have to look out for in experiments is called the placebo effect. And the placebo effect is the tendency of patients to respond favorably to any apparent treatment because of their expectations about the treatment. So if we compare a group of patients receiving a treatment to those receiving no treatment at all, then the treated group will get both any benefit of the treatment and the benefit of the placebo effect. So even if a person is given a placebo treatment, like a sugar pill, they'll have some expectation that because they're getting a treatment, then their condition should improve. And that will have a little bit of an effect. If instead we compare a group of patients receiving a treatment to those receiving a placebo treatment, then both the groups get the benefit of the placebo effect. And then any statistically significant difference can be attributed to the actual treatment. Let's look at an example. So St. John's wort is a common herbal remedy for depression. Herbs and other natural remedies do not have to go through the same testing as drugs approved by the FDA. However, some of them are now being studied more carefully. The Journal of the American Medical Association reported a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial in which 200 patients with major depression were assigned at random to take either St. John's wort or a dummy pill that looked and tasted the same. And they found that the herb was safe but not effective for treatment of major depression. So 100 of the patients were given St. John's wort, and 100 of the patients were given a placebo treatment, which was a dummy pill that looked and tasted exactly the same. And at the end of the study, when they compared the patients, they found no statistically significant difference in the effects of the treatments on the patients. So that means that St. John's wort was not an effective treatment for depression. Now let's talk about observational studies. An observational study does not try to manipulate the environment, so it does not assign treatments to people. It simply observes the measurements of variables of interest that result from people's free choices. So why would we want to do this instead of an experiment? Well, this kind of study is generally done when assignment of a treatment to a person is unethical. For example, you can't ask pregnant women to smoke because that's unethical, but some pregnant women do smoke by choice, so you can use an observational study to study the differences between pregnant women who do smoke and pregnant women who don't. It's also sometimes impossible to assign a treatment. For example, you can't assign a person an ethnicity. You can't tell them, well, you are going to be Native American for the purposes of this study. That's just something that occurs by chance, so you just have to use observational studies in that case to figure out what kind of difference ethnicity plays in certain situations. The problem with observational studies is that it's much more difficult to eliminate confounding variables than it is in an experiment. So in general, experiments are preferable, but they're not always possible. So when experiments aren't possible, we rely on observational studies. Let's look at an example of smoking and health. So we can't ethically assign groups of people to smoke or not to smoke. So a direct experiment isn't possible. The most careful studies of smoking have selected samples of smokers and non-smokers, and then followed them for many years, eventually recording the cause of death. This is not an experiment because the subjects themselves choose whether or not to smoke. A study of British doctors found that the death rate from lung cancer among smokers was 20 times the rate among non-smokers. A separate study of American men found that the death rate from lung cancer among smokers was 11 times higher than among non-smokers. That's a pretty big difference in their findings there, but you can agree that both of those studies found that smoking is a statistically significant factor in whether a person will develop lung cancer and eventually die from lung cancer. Lastly, let's take a look at this chart, and this will help you decide whether a certain study is an observational study or an experiment, and what kind of experiment it is. So starting at the top, the first question we ask is the environment manipulated? If the environment is not manipulated, then that's an observational study. So if the people in the study choose which group they're going to be in, for example, if they're a smoker or non-smoker, that's an observational study. If the environment is manipulated, then that's some kind of experiment and not an observational study, and we move on to the next question. Is a comparison group used? If no comparison group is used, then this is an uncontrolled experiment, and this is what we saw in the last section when the college had only the online course and had no classroom course to compare it with. If a comparison group is used, then we ask if random assignment was used to put subjects in one group or the other. If they were not randomly assigned, then this is a comparative experiment, but not a randomized comparative experiment. If subjects were randomly assigned to a treatment or control group, then that is a randomized comparative experiment. So when you're reading about a study, you can go through this chart and it will help you decide which type of study or experiment you're dealing with. That finishes up Chapter 7. The things you should know for this section. You should know how experiments are controlled for good results. We have to take into account the placebo effect, and a double-blind experiment is the best for getting good results. You should also know what an observational study is and when it is used instead of an experiment.